This week we're talking about science communication and the way that it levels the playing field for all. So let me advance my slide here. So last time we talked about why scientists should be able to communicate well with everyone. We talked about the idea of science literacy, or the idea that people are familiar with science. We critiqued scientific news coverage to see where they were lacking with respect to scientific accuracy. And sadly, we found that there's a lot of places where science news coverage is lacking. So today we're going to talk about sort of a related subject, one that it's difficult to talk about because by at the end of this, actually, you'll realize why it's hard to talk about this, because whenever people's voices aren't heard, you basically never realize that they are not being heard. So it's kind of like a marginalization that happens without you realizing it. So we're going to talk about ways that we can be aware of that, and ways that we can, easy ways, I think easier ways than trying to figure out who's not in the conversation, just adding more voices to the conversation, because that's always really good. So here's the problem. The problem is creating inclusive science culture. And I was inspired in part to do this lecture from my own writing student. When she sat down to write, she doubted herself, and she literally couldn't write a word because she didn't think she had anything useful to say. The imposter syndrome and self-doubt literally gave her writer's block. People around the world can't access science communication because they don't speak English or they don't have internet. So these are all ways that, let's say you're a woman in science, you're already a minority in science, and like it's kind of a layer cake of sexism and racism. But sexism in science is both pretty well known, talked about often, and also very easy to, as we talked about, very easy to see in science culture. Like you can even do a scientific study and like find it. So that's a huge problem for science. My solution is to just become aware of these things. And it takes a lot of, as we talked about in the sociology of science lecture, introspecting on the culture of science, seeing who has the power in science, who's doing all the publishing, who's getting their name out there, who isn't getting their name out there, who's maybe getting like kicked out of science, which, when you get kicked out of science, you're basically being shut away from like a career option. So we don't really want that to happen, because if there is no women in science, then questions that are important to women in science don't get answered. So the inclusive science culture is actually a really, really huge problem. So and it's also one that has a very personal cost. So think about all the women that have left science, whose advisors. I read this one story of this advisor that stole their grad student's project and just did it themselves. This woman in science, and she had to go to therapy for years and years, and she still has problems trusting people. So that's like the individual cost of sexism in science. The social cost is obviously huge. Social problems go unanswered. Things like women's health research. Because remember, in science, the default is to have like just whoever you can find, usually white males, college age people for your studies. So that's actually a huge problem. And it's because in doing stuff like that, we assume that the default is like males, college age, white, healthy males. So we're basically doing research, convenience research. We're not doing research that's truly inclusive. And it's not just, you know, finding people of different races. It's actually like going and finding people of different cultures and different countries. Because as I mentioned, people can't access SciComm because they don't speak English, and a lot of SciComm is in English. So, or people might wonder, like, how can I get people? I just interviewed Ozzy Moyo, who is a scholar in Africa, and he studies Indigenous science communication in Africa. And he was talking about understanding the different ways of storytelling that Indigenous cultures in Africa have, and how that's different from the normal mainstream Western narrative of science and science communication. So celebrating and amplifying diverse voices is a good idea. It reduces gatekeeping, it improves science culture. It's a way to share more ideas and give new perspectives. It makes science more comprehensive, more inclusive, and just generally better. And it's always better to have more people included in something. So this is a question. You probably know these people. So Do you recognize these scientists? Here, I will show. Well, this is Pierre and Marie Curie. Marie Curie was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and then she ended up winning one in both chemistry and I want to say physics as well for her studies with her husband. She used to keep radioactive stuff like on her table. I don't know if they had shielding back then. And then in World War I, she used to drive around the battlefield with like a little X-ray or something. She was very, very amazing scientist. Then we have Albert Einstein. Hopefully you know who Albert Einstein is. These are some of the greats in science. And I'm not saying these are bad scientists or their science is any less important, but they are just scientists that we all know, mostly of sort of like Western science narrative. And we have Galileo, was really relevant given the solar eclipse yesterday. Enrico Fermi, you may not know Enrico Fermi, Fermilab in Chicago is named after him. And then here we have Gregor Mendel. And so here are some scientists that you may not recognize. I recognize one of them because they're my thermodynamics professor in college. So we have, this is Har Gobind Khorana, Nobel Prize winner in biochemistry, Indian guy. We have Mungi Bawendi, who was my thermodynamics professor in college, that won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. Pretty cool. He's of Tunisian descent. Then we have Ahmed Zewail, who is from Africa, the father of femtochemistry, another Nobel Prize winner, and Tu Youyou, who discovered malaria treatments. And I don't know why I don't recognize these scientists. I mean, obviously I recognize my own professor, but I don't know why we don't recognize these people. I think let me just show you some even more people. This is Avicenna, a Muslim philosopher and physician, and here we have Maimonides, an ancient Jewish physician. You may have heard of these people, you may not have heard of these people. These are also greats of science and medicine with their own important, influential contributions. Here we have a paper I screenshotted about physicians of ancient India, where it talks about the fact that there's no dearth of work on the systems of medicine and medical literature in ancient India. However, the people who are responsible for the healing have not received much attention. So there's like this whole other non-Western narrative that, first of all, if we talk about that, we can include the non-Western world in our discussions of science and science communication. It also helps create a more complete picture because as important as like Galileo is, there's also a lot of people that are I'm not saying like don't talk about Galileo or Einstein, but there's this, we can look beyond Western SciComm narratives. So a lot of science, especially in the global South, has happened in the global South, but we take it for granted, or maybe we don't know about it. So for example, Muslim merchants were navigating the seas and trading in the Middle East well before the Europeans were, because they were actually from the Middle East. So here's the 16th century Arabic seafarers. Looking past Western STEM narratives gives a global perspective and is just more complete, and it helps include more people, especially if you want to reach more people in the global South. It's the best way to do it is by speaking their language, talking about people that are important to them, people that they maybe have known about that like we don't know about here in the West. Here's one example, Middle Eastern science. Here's some Arabic words that have enriched the scientific vocab: alchemy, alcohol, algebra, algorithm, alkali, azimuth, elixir, some of these star names: Betelgeuse, Aldebaran, Mizar, and Regal. This is a treatise on the astrolabe, which is some kind of thing that you can use to view, I guess, the skies. I can't really read this. By 13th century Persian astronomer. Perhaps it's no coincidence that I'm Persian. So this really resonates with me, right? Because I'm Persian. I'm like, oh, I love science. And I think it gives a global perspective. It makes science more global, which science is a global activity. So in case you don't know what the global South is, I've never heard of it being the global South until we had someone write an article about the global South and why they need science communication for the Fancy Comma blog. And so I've always heard of it as developed nations and undeveloped nations. So it's basically a hemispheric, in a way, almost hemispheric. It's got like, so North America, then we have Russia, these nations, basically Europe. Then we have in the global, those are the global North nations. Then in the global South, we have obviously South America, part of Central America, Africa, the Middle East, like China, India, etc. So And all of those people are doing science. And sure, they value and respect the achievements of Galileo, but there's also local big names in their specific culture that if you really want to, speak to them about science and science communication, talk about the people, get on their level with their science communication and scientists that are their heroes. So the global SciComm challenges in the global south, and I've learned this just from talking to other people. I haven't actually done this work myself. Nikita Rutke, I don't know how to say her last name, but she wrote an article called "Why We Need the Global South and Science Communication and How to Get There" for the Fancy Comma blog. So she says language barriers, limited access to resources and infrastructure, information poverty or lack of access to information, limited financial support, materials, spaces, and mentorship, more general non-SciComm specific challenges, weak post-pandemic growth, changing climate, and high inflation. So imagine trying to do research amidst drought, fires, and floods. And honestly, like just in the pandemic, that research became impossible. I mean, everyone started doing COVID research, so I can't imagine what it would be like trying to do research amidst drought, fires, and floods. I think that would be tough. And that's why we need to have greater science communication in the global south, because a lot of those places they have, and as well as the US and developed nations, they have a lot of issues with climate, sustainability, environmental resilience, whatever you want to call it. Just like making sure that we have a planet that's, livable, clean, healthy, sustainable. There's a number of ways that people talk about that, but I just like to think about it as environmental sustainability and kind of from a selfish perspective of, will we be able to live on this earth in a million years? And it's kind of a daunting thought. So Nikita also gave some ideas on ways to boost Global South SciComm participation, access to training and resources, inclusive and diverse language, regional languages, recruiting and promoting diverse voices, thinking maybe beyond Galileo. Like there's got to be like every culture has their own scientific heroes that they revere more than anyone. So and now we'll get to Oswald's article. So he wrote an article called Indigenous Science an Indigenous African Knowledge Framework for Science Communication. So in Africa, indigenous populations have an oral storytelling tradition that doesn't translate well to the 5 Ws and 1H style of journalism. In African folk tales, the climax doesn't come first. However, when we write news, the main idea occurs in the first 40 to 50 words, using colonial hangovers of English as a medium of communication. And scientific experts drawn from the West to address indigenous African communities stifles the growth of science communication within the global South. So, internet infrastructure plays a huge role in science literacy. We take internet connectivity for granted in the Western world, but it can be tough to come by in the global South, especially in the rural areas. Internet connectivity is just one of the many infrastructure challenges faced in the global South. Power outages. I had this interview I was doing, and we couldn't do the interview the first day. They couldn't do the interview because one guy, he didn't have internet. And then, or like he had internet, but it just was terrible. And then the next week they had E. coli in their water. And so some people were sick. And then the next week there was a rainfall happening that took out their power. So in the rural areas of Kenya. So, that was with under the microscope, but we finally did that interview, but it was so hard. And after that, I was like, well, I don't even know how I could even reach these people as a science communicator, because how can they don't get on the internet? So I asked them, how do you guys do science communication if you don't have the internet? And they were just like, we just do our science communication in person. I was like, that's smart. And that makes sense. So there's no other real way to connect with global South SciCommers except for the internet. So these issues can basically exclude people. And the crazy thing is, we don't even really know about this because we're just like, oh yeah. And here in the US, we're like, oh, we're on the internet. Like, just check out my website. But we kind of take for granted our internet. So, but that's just because you have a website and you tweet about science communication. A lot of times you're just reaching other people that have internet, that can access internet that day. So, and Fancy Comma is very global, but I think that because we're so global, we're starting to realize these challenges. So you can use science communication to tackle information poverty and digital divides, SciComm and regional languages. So, like, not everyone in the global south speaks English. And as you know, they don't even speak one language in Africa. Africa is a whole continent. So, there's tons of different languages. India has a lot of different regional languages. Consider SciComm that doesn't rely heavily on digital media or has low bandwidth. Like, there's web pages that have like a ton of videos or like a ton of pictures. Like, I personally find those websites really annoying because it takes forever to load. Apparently, it's just some people can't even load those because they don't have the bandwidth to do that. Also, consider partnering with SciComm organizations in the global south. If you speak different Indian languages, you live in the US, you're Indian, you're an African person living in the US, you can partner digitally with these SciComm organizations, if only to get a better idea of the SciComm needs and challenges, connect with your people, advance science. We've talked to Cybrio in India, which is basically like Fancy Comma, but in India. But their work is much more targeted. Like they're more like strategic consulting. And then Under the Microscope is based in Kenya. There's a number of interviews we have on our YouTube. So, but yeah. So that's actually it for this week.